You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. For some women, their wedding day is the best day of their life, and for many brides it is, unless perhaps you're a child. 25,000 girls each day under the age of 18, mainly in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, are being married off to men almost double their age. 1 in 7 girls in many developing countries are married off before the age of 15. When this takes place, girls are often forced to leave school, abandoning their education, subjected to domestic violence and sexual abuse. Forced early marriage in many regions of the world is arranged by parents for their own children, often illegally, but justified in that it is an appropriate way for them to grow up and leaves them less at risk of being raped or losing their virginity to someone other than their husband. The number of 15-year-olds getting married before the age of 15 is expected to double by the next decade. So to discuss child brides and child marriages, why and where it takes place, I'm joined by Naana Otoo-Oyortey, Executive Director of the Foundation for Women's Health Research and Development, Forward UK, Margaret Owen, Director of Widows for Peace Through Democracy, Waleed Ahmad, Head Librarian of Baitul Futuh Mosque in London, and on the telephone, Sameem Ali, herself forced into a marriage when she was a child. Sameem now campaigns against forced marriages. So I'll start with you first, Naana. Can you explain to us why children are becoming brides at such a young age?
For quite a number of families, this is forced through poverty. The poorer the families are, the more likely they are going to marry off their daughters. In parts of Africa where I'm more familiar with, you'd find that the marriage is preempted because of gains from the bride price. And often the bride price could be anything as much as 20 cows or 5 cows or 10 cows. There is also the fact that the families fear that the girls would lose their virginity as a result of interacting early with boys. So they're forced to be safely married to enable them to control the girl's sexuality. In some cases, you're finding that marriage of girls is to stop a feud in the family or to support any incidents that have happened in the family. And you find parts of Ghana called the trocosi, where the girls are actually given to the gods to also marry. So there are different forms of marriage. It's not just being married to a man, but sometimes married to a god. You know.
Can you explain that a little?
In parts of Ghana, where they call this practice trocosi, if a family has committed a crime, a girl who is a virgin is given to the god to marry off and appease the family's feud. So it actually has been perpetuated in quite. You find it in the east coast of, on the coast of West Africa, parts of Ghana, parts of Togo, and parts of Benin.
When you say God, who is that represented by in the community?
Oh, definitely you're given to a shrine, and invariably it's the priests in the shrine who then become your husband. So that's how it's actually done. But in parts of Tanzania, where I work more, you'll also find situations where actually child marriage is not necessarily being married to a man. You can also find some being married to women. So there are different forms of marriages, although the majority of girls are married to men. So we need to recognize that there are diverse forms of child brides or child marriages.
And what age are these children being married to gods, women or men in Tanzania and Ghana?
It could be as early as 11 years, 10 years. In Tanzania, the girls have to go through female genital mutilation, and that's an initiation. And in parts of Mara region where we work, they go through this initiation of FGM, and then you're then forced into the marriages. So you then are paraded through the town, and then that's when you get requests for marriage.
Margaret, just to come to you, you work with the Widows for Peace Through Democracy. Can you explain a little bit about what you do?
Well, I'm the director of this international organisation, which really is the only organisation in the world which advocates for widows' rights, because the treatment of all widows, whether they're child widows or elderly widows or young widows with children, it's one of the most neglected areas of gender and human rights. It's really, really hidden, the terrible stigma and violence that widows experience, particularly in Africa and South Asia and parts even of Eastern Europe, in the Middle East and even in Southeast Asia. There's a sort of, widows are sort of inauspicious. They're the sort of evil eye, and the violence that they experience both within their families and in the community is very grave and extreme and hidden. But also because of armed conflict and revolution, violence in so many countries, HIV and AIDS, the numbers of widows has grown unprecedentedly in recent decades. And within this great, often uncounted numbers of widows, there are uncounted millions of child widows. And some of them may be as young as 3 or 4. I mean, in Afghanistan, there are traditions about badal where you actually exchange your children at birth. You actually agree and they get married. And maybe it's not consummated when they're so young, but they often, many of these child marriages are consummated even before the girl reaches the menarche, which gives, this is a horrible thing. And so, but my organisation focuses on what happens then to the children who are married, often to much older men, often to sick men, to elderly men. Because remember that because of poverty, and many widows in countries, for example, where the dowry system is, they can't even afford the dowry, so they actually have to find someone to take that little girl, because they can't afford to keep the girl. If they have to choose which children they'll keep the boy and put that child into a marriage. There's an increase in child marriages. And then what happens when that man dies? And it's interesting because UNICEF, for example, has been targeting child marriage for a long time. Many governments target, but they never actually go on to address the logical consequences of a child marriage, which is child widowhood. So that is something terrible, that a child can be widowed when she's still a child and experience all the stigma and discrimination that widows anyway in their cultures experience.
Could you just briefly explain what stigma is attached to being a widow at such a young age? Is it that she has therefore no more access to any dowry, any money, or that she's no longer a virgin? Why is there such a stigma?
Let me just explain generally. In Africa and in South Asia particularly, and elsewhere, as I've said, even though there are many laws like the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, widows' lives tend to be determined by local interpretations of tradition, custom and religion. And in these cultures, a widow is simply a chattel. She can be inherited when her husband dies. Whatever the law says and whatever they've done, their governments, to ratify international conventions, the widow often has no rights to inherit. She's kicked out of her homestead, or she's actually treated like a chattel and inherited by the estate and exploited as an economic, sexual and social slave. So that is the story of widows. But when it's a child, it's even worse, because she has the triple disabilities of being a woman, being a widow and being a child widow, and she has no hope. She can never be married again. She will be probably maybe exploited in prostitution. She's incredibly vulnerable to trafficking. We've had reports now from Iraq about trafficking and prostitution, where many of the victims are either very young widows or the daughters of widows because of poverty. In Afghanistan now, the widows who are so poor, who have absolutely no rights, are actually selling their daughters for something like $10. So you see, the child widow is incredibly vulnerable. She's also going to be very vulnerable to HIV and AIDS. It's also in the context of HIV and AIDS where there's a myth that if a man can have sex with a virgin child, it can either cure him or it's safe. So there's a huge business now in actually child marrying these children, and then they become widows.
Thanks, Margaret. Waleed Ahmad, I'll come to you now. You're the head librarian at the Baitul Futuh Mosque in London, the largest mosque in Europe?
That's right, in Western Europe.
In
yes.
Western Europe. Do you know of cases of child marriage taking place in the UK?
I have not come across any such instances at all, and what I'm hearing is quite alarming, all right, but it's not something that I have experienced or I have come across. Neither the the case of the stigma against widows mentioned by Margaret. That again is something that's not something that I've experienced at all. In fact, my own mother became a widow when she was quite young, and she later got remarried. We didn't feel that she was stigmatized by the community at large. I think that a lot of it, of what is being mentioned, does occur, and it occurs in certain communities and certain areas, and it stems from ignorance more than anything else. And if we are going to resolve it or improve matters for women, widows, and prevention of child brides, then I think that education has a big role to play in all this. There are economic factors as well, but it's education that will actually enable people to assess as to what the best solution for the economic problems are. I think it's also a tendency for people who are in poverty to consider children who are female to be a liability, not an asset like a male born would be. A male born a son is an asset because it is somebody who will give a helping hand on the farm or to whatever business the family may be conducting, and it is considered as something that is very positive. Whereas because of ignorance, more than anything else, a female is considered as a liability, as a mouth to feed, and the sooner that out of ignorance the parents can fend them off in marriage elsewhere, then the better it is. So I think that if there is an improvement in education, then much of this can hopefully be improved, if not resolved altogether.
Globally?
Globally, yes.
Now, Sameem, we'll come to you now. I've just obviously asked Waleed Ahmad if he knew of any circumstance of a child marriage ceremony taking place in the UK. What's your story?
My story, I was married at the age of 13. I was a child.
So, did this ceremony take place in the UK, or were you sent abroad?
I was taken abroad at the age of 12 years old to Pakistan, and I was forced into a marriage in Pakistan at the age of 13. The Maulavis over there, I do agree when it comes to education. You know, they didn't know the concept of how old a child should be before she gets married, and so they didn't even ask that question. Actually, they just saw me, and you know, because the guy wanted to marry me, who was double my age, you know, they just agreed with him. And so, you know, I think a lot of education, yes, it needs to happen, but also, you know, parents need to be educated, you know, about the legal age of marriage. And I was brought back to the UK at 14. I'm going to give you my experience of what happened here. It's not just abroad that this happens. I was brought back to this country at the age of 14. I was pregnant at that time, and no questions were asked in this country. You know, the teachers didn't ask any questions, the social services, the GPs, and I attended all my appointments. I had a baby in a hospital in the UK, and the nurses and doctors didn't ask any questions at that time. And so it's not just ignorance amongst the uneducated, and so, you know, I do disagree with that. It's ignorance amongst all. It's ignorance when it comes to, you know, oh, it's that's their culture. Let's just leave it at that. And so, you can't say it's ignorance amongst the uneducated. I do disagree with that. And so, I was a mother in the UK at the age of 14, and I know how it affects people firsthand, because it doesn't really kick in until you're grown up. I would say those words because until your late 20s, that's when all the psycho effect kicks in, because you do have all the grown up feelings that come in and kicks in. As a child, you accept anything and you will accept everything, but when you're grown up, it hurts. It really does.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Joining me to discuss child brides is Margaret Owen, Director of Widows for Peace Through Democracy, Waleed Ahmad from the Baitul Futuh Mosque in London, and on the telephone, Sameem Ali, herself forced into a marriage when she was a child. Sameem now campaigns against forced marriages. And Naana Otoo-Oyortey, Executive Director of Foundation for Women's Health Research and Development, Forward UK. Naana, how much can society learn from what is actually taking place in Britain and the lessons that can be learnt and the psychological analysis of what takes place after a child is sent to wed and has herself then a child?
Recent statistics from UNFPA is showing that within the next 10 years there'll be more than 140 million girls who have been married, in the sense that social workers, policymakers, education sectors all have to be very much aware of their responsibilities towards meeting the needs and to safeguard children who are in their care. I don't think that the UK has the best legal the laws on marriage, but you'll find that even in some countries in Africa, I worked in Tanzania, the legal age of marriage is 14 years. Even though it's 15 years, you are allowed to marry at 14 with parental consent. Now, at the same time in that country, if you have sex with an 18-year-old girl below 18 years, it's statutory rape. There's a lot of double standards in the laws and a lot of contradictory laws. So we need to look at the legislation and the environment to protect girls. Now, if a 14-year-old girl is not in school, then there must be questions asked why that 14-year-old is not in school. I don't know whether Sameem had the opportunity to go back to school and whether she was supported to go to school, but I don't think that was the situation. And this is where we need to learn lessons that in the UK, I suppose now there is a lot more attention with the forced marriage unit. I know that in Europe, they're trying to learn more from UK, because we seem to be taking a much stronger stand. However, we do realize that the problem is a lot more, and there is still a lot of hidden pockets of girls. Recently, there's been a UK all-party parliamentary group hearing on child marriage, and it also looked at the situation in the UK and learning lessons from different contexts. We do need to recognize that we have to raise this issue in different sectors, in different arenas, and to also tie it up with development cooperation, and to ensure that countries that are given support from the UK government also understand the dynamics of these issues. Because if girls are being pulled out of school, it makes nonsense of having to support girls in schools. It makes nonsense of sponsoring girls in schools when they will be pulled out of schools to get married. So we do need to recognize there are a lot of links, and not just policymakers, but also NGOs need to be very much aware of the girls. I mean, how many people sponsor girls who will be pulled out of marriage to be married without people knowing? We do need to recognize that we all have to play a role.
Waleed, what are your thoughts?
Thoughts about?
Is there a role that mosques could play for women to protect them, offer them more protection?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm very saddened to learn about Sameem's experience, and I think that I have no, how can I say, very few good words to say about the mullahs she mentioned. I think they've got a lot to answer for in distorting the faith, Islam as a faith, and using it to create all kinds of ill acts or wrong acts and bad acts and ill feeling. And I think this is a case in point. I also think that Islam also, I think when it comes to education, then we also need to promote Islam in its proper light and promote the moderate form of Islam, which the vast majority of Muslims subscribe to. I know that in the media it is the extremist version that is perpetuated more than anything else, but the vast majority conform to a moderate form of Islam, and in that this kind of practice of child marriage would not be tolerated at all. And this kind of fear of poverty would also not be tolerated. And that needs to be promoted. I can just mention one or two things. I mean, for instance, the founder of Islam said that he who is blessed with daughters, blessed is the word used, all right, and raises them up well, is going to be granted heaven. The words that he used is going to be with me in heaven and will be as close to me as the two fingers of one hand. So that shows the value, or emphasizes the value of having daughters. That you may feel that having sons will support you in your worldly life, but your ultimate goal is going to be fulfilled by serving your daughters. And to fend them off in marriage early is not raising them up well, is not looking after their concerns. Now, these kind of teachings are going to be very potent in those areas, especially those rural maybe areas where Islam prevails. And if these kind of teachings are promoted, then I'm sure that there can be a positive impact placed on this kind of practice.
Yes, Sameem, I'd love to hear from you now. What's your response to that?
Yeah, can I come in?
Yep.
I just want to say I have no ill feeling about my my faith, my religion, and so I don't know where he got that from, and Islam has got nothing to do with forced marriage and child marriages. I mentioned the Maulvi because I am a Muslim, and the Maulvi is a person who actually did the nikah, and so but Islam has got nothing to do with it. It's all the if we use religion and to actually and to tackle this, then it ain't going to go away. We need to put our heads together and tackle it on a global level, like you said. With the right people around the table, and we need to actually put in place some kind of global education package. We can't just do it alone. And I wouldn't want to put any religion at the forefront of what we need to do on this.
Margaret, would you agree with Sameem there? I mean, you're the only international group dedicated to the support for widows.
Well, I think I admire Salim's courage in coming out and speaking like this, because I'm also a human rights lawyer as well as being director of this widows organisation. I'm absolutely horrified by her story about how the issues connected with her, what had happened to her, were completely ignored by her school, her GP, the social workers, the people where she had the baby. I'm absolutely ashamed and horrified. And that comes back to what my colleagues here at the table have said about it isn't just a question of educating people in the villages and in the countries where it happens. We actually have to educate everybody, even in this country, who is concerned and who would actually know about these things. But I just wanted to say that what we need to do, this is all to do. I mean, the increase in child marriages, the terrible discrimination and poverty of women and girls. It's all to do with gender inequality and the power relations between men and women in their host countries, and the fact that women are so often have no access to a justice system. Even where it pretends to be a justice system, they have no access to it. And actually the next year at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, it takes place every year in New York, and the priority theme in March next year is how to prevent and eliminate violence against women and girls. And child marriage is an unbelievable and horrific violation of girls' rights. It isn't a girls' and women's issue. It affects the whole of society. It expands poverty and expands sort of deprivation.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Joining me to discuss child brides is Margaret Owen, Director of Widows for Peace Through Democracy, Waleed Ahmad from the Baitul Futuh Mosque in London, Naana Otoo-Oyortey, the Executive Director of Foundation for Women's Health Research and Development, Forward UK, and on the telephone, Sameem Ali, herself forced into a marriage when she was a child. Sameem now campaigns against forced marriages.
Schools in this country, they don't have to put a reason on the form of why a person has been struck off the register. As long as they can tick all the boxes within 6 weeks, they can take that child off. And so, that needs to be fixed. That's the first thing. But nobody wants to take that on board. Nobody wants to actually, and to actually put that forward to the educators, because the educators have got a long list of other children who can take up that place. And so, there are so many things that need to be fixed. And until we start shouting and raising our voices, it's going to carry on. And I do think that we need to talk about it on a global level.
Nana, you're at the grassroots of actually doing something about this. How much of a battle have you got on your hands?
I think the battle is that there is a huge number of girls who are affected, and very often the focus is very much on prevention. But we actually have to recognize that prevention is about preventing those who are at risk, but we also have to address the needs of the millions of girls who are already married. Now, a 14-year-old girl who is married lacks access to education, lacks access to employment opportunities, and the worst bit is the children of these children. And how do we neglect these children? Because if we neglect them, they will tend to marry again. And our Forward, we're trying to work on a national level, but also working in global partnerships. And I'm glad you brought in the Girls Not Brides. We're members of the Girls Not Brides. We've supported Tanzania to set up a national network to really galvanize action at the national level, because we need voices at the grassroots. At the moment, the most exciting bit of our work is working with girls in schools to set up the girls' clubs, but also working with child mothers to also set up networks where we provide them with employment opportunities and access to girls to really raise awareness and be at the forefront of this global move.
I'd like to thank all my guests, Naana Otoo-Oyortey, Margaret Owen, Waleed Ahmad, and of course Sameem Ali, for joining us and sharing her story so bravely once again with us on The Voice of Russia. Thanks, Sameem.